Okay, then we seem to have a nice group of people, so I'll get us started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Matthew Jukes. I'm a researcher in the International Education Division at RTI International, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this CEDEL webinar. CEDEL stands for the Center of Excellence for Development in Impact and Learning, and it's a project funded through UK aid with money from the British people. Part of their remit is to develop and test innovative methods for evaluation in international development contexts. And part of that remit is includes measurement, what to measure, how to measure, and how to ensure validity. Something that I think that hasn't received as much attention, perhaps, as research designs in the evaluation discussions, and something that I hope we will address today. With three great speakers. We have Orazio Attanasio, who is a Cowles Professor of Economics at Yale University and a research fellow at IFS. Sharon Wolf, who's an assistant professor of human development and quantitative methods at the University of Pennsylvania. And Olga Romero, who's the director of monitoring and evaluation of public policies at Columbia National Planning Department. So great, we have an economist, a developmental psychologist, and a policymaker. So we should have a nice triangulation of opinions. So before we get started, with just a few housekeeping points. I'd encourage everyone to think of questions as the speakers go through their presentations, and to write questions when they come to mind in the Q&A function. So if you can use the Q&A function, and I'll be relaying the questions after the presentations. The webinar has been recorded and will be available afterwards on the CEDEL website. And I'd encourage you at the end of the webinar to post, to complete the webinar survey. You should be redirected to that at the end of the webinar. Okay, well, I'm looking forward to the presentations, and Orazio, if I can ask you to kick us off.
Thank you, Matthew. First of all, let me thank CEDEL for organizing this event. And let me start by sharing my screen. And I hope you see it now. So what I'm gonna talk about today is about measurement and evaluation. Measurement has been quite important in my thinking about how do we do evaluation, and more generally, how do we bring economic theory or theory in general to data. So what I want to do is to talk about in my 15 minutes, I believe, is talk about the two messages that I would like to give. The first one, it seems almost boring in a way, what to measure and how we measure when we do evaluations. And those as two subpoints. The first one is what kind of measurement tools do we have, the old one, then possibly some new ones. And the second point, sub-point there is how, what do we measure, outcomes and the drivers of outcomes. I'll come to that in a second. The second point I would like to do is to dig a bit deeper and be very specific about an issue. When we evaluate a specific intervention, what kind of a metric do we use to evaluate programs? So when do we say that an impact is small or large? So let me start with this first point, is what to measure and how. And let me start by talking about existing outcome measures. There is a widespread tendency in the profession among policymakers and the like to measure outcomes of interest using standardized measures. Over the last 10 years, I've been doing quite a bit of work on intervention on child development. And everybody in child development uses, I'm thinking now about children aged 0 to 3. You use the Baileys, because what else would you want to use? That's the standard measure. And often these measures come with a standard scoring algorithm. So the publisher sells you the measure, in this example, the Baileys, but analogous consideration go for other measures. And they also, the measure is typically made of a number of items. So you put the child under a certain number of tests, or ask the mother of the child a certain number of questions. And then, in addition to the individual items, the publisher sells you a scoring algorithm. So you're supposed to input those items into it, and then the algorithm spits out a measure or a variety of measures on subscales of development, say, and that's the way it's done typically. Now, unfortunately, unless you have the patience to read the 120 pages of a manual that describes how the algorithm was constructed, you don't discover that those scoring algorithms were designed maybe decades ago and they were standardized on a population that was very different from the population that you want to apply the text to. So I don't think the standard of scoring algorithms are necessarily optimal. And a much better practice would be to construct one's own scoring and measure, and therefore adapt it to different contexts. And you can also start to think about adding new items or changing the measures a little bit. Now, I'm not saying that this is a trivial exercise. This can be very complex and very delicate. One should play at its own risk in a way. There are good reasons why journals and the wide community at large require standardized algorithm. At least we know what people are doing. But having said that, I don't know I'm not sure that always using the same scoring algorithms and the same standardized measure is the optimal strategy. There are the big challenges is one, if one constructs a new test, a new measure, should validate it and should try to assess the comparability with other measures and the like. So that's my first sub-point on all measures. Now, I suggested that one could introduce new items and maybe even thinking of constructing new tests. And by the way, going back to child development, some big and very valuable efforts are being done. There is a large initiative that is funded by the Gates Foundation's GSET is called, that tries to combine existing items from a variety of different tests and combine them together to build up new indexes of child development. And these efforts that should be open source, open access, and should be promoted internationally, I think are extremely valuable. If nothing else, another item that is important to keep in mind there is that you want measures and measuring tools that can be deployed and implemented at scale, even in difficult situations. Now, the point about the new measures. Often interventions can have impacts on a variety of outcomes. And I think it's very, very important to measure all of them. You know, you design an intervention, say, to improve the functioning of childcare centers, and hoping that the children will benefit more. But maybe mothers or parents might have enjoy or suffer from consequences of that intervention. Or think of an intervention which is a transfer to poor families, food transfer, and one would like to measure the malnutrition and the like, but intervention might have consequences on prices, and so all those outcomes should be measured, and one should not restrict oneself to just the narrow outcomes that targeted by the intervention. And a more general point related to the previous one is that I think when we do evaluation, it's fine to do a properly designed randomized controlled trial and compare treatment control outcomes. But I think that's only part of the story. I think a proper evaluation should not only estimate the impact of the intervention, but understand the mechanisms that generate it. And to do that, it is extremely important to measure what in the literature are defined as mediating factors, and in situations where one tries to affect behavior, individual behavior, what are the drivers of those behaviors? Again, in the example of child development in the early years and parenting practices, I think we have shied away for many years from measuring individual beliefs, individual attitudes, bargaining powers within couples. I put those points there because these are things that we have been trying in a variety of contexts to elicit direct measures of, and I think those are important point. Another example is microfinance and insurance in developing countries. And there, I think is interesting and important to measure subjective expectations about income, about investment returns, and networks. It is now becoming clear that many impacts that are the determinants of many impacts, many interventions are driven by the structure of networks, by the quality of information within networks, and by where in the network the intervention operates. And so we need to get information about those. So that was my first point, my first message. The second message is much more practical and much more concrete in a way, is the what metric do we use to evaluate impacts. It is common practice to measure the impact of interventions in terms of standard deviation of the control group. So one collects data on an outcome, computes the standard deviation and the mean in the control group, subtracts the mean, and divides by the standard deviation, and that becomes the metric that is used in intervention to define whether intervention is large or small. 0.1 is small, 0.5 is quite large of a standard deviation. And I think that this has a long history, and there are good justification to do that. One wants to establish a metric that does not depend on the types of measurement tools used. If I tell you that there's got 2 points on the Bailey score, it might not mean a lot to you. And moreover, you try to get comparability across different contexts. However, in some situations, I think that the practice can be very misleading. think of it as situations where the target population is extremely diverse. And then you'll find that the standard deviation in the control group is very large. It might be the case that the standard deviation is large because there are a few extremely smart kids that go off the scale, or some extremely deprived kids that go down the other direction. And then, when you get the impact of the intervention, you divide by a large number. And so an intervention might look as having a very small impact, while the impact is actually quite large. Or the opposite might be true. If you work with an extremely deprived situation, everyone scores very, very low. It's very homogeneous, and the impacts will look huge even when they are not. So what this is some work that we've been doing with Sarah Penn and Sharon Wolf, who talk after me, and we proposed a different approach. So the idea here, we see this as a complement to the standard practice rather than a substitute. So we might want to identify a population of reference, define the gap in outcome that the intervention intends to fill, the outcome in the target and in the population of reference, and then measure the impact of the intervention as a fraction of the gap that is filled. Now, obviously, there are some important challenges. One, first has to define what is the population of reference. Then we need to get data on this population, and then ensure that the measures that are used in the population of reference and the evaluation samples are comparable. So we are doing this, try to put it in practice. So we are doing providing 5 different examples in different contexts. We have 2 interventions in Colombia. All this is child development. So in the first intervention in Colombia is the children are 2 years old at the end of the intervention, and we use the intervention is in rural Colombia. We use as a population of reference a sample that we have from Bogota. I'll tell you about that in a second to make.
So you have a minute left.
Yeah.
If you wrap up.
Okay, so then I have another intervention in Colombia, 1 in India, and 1 in Ghana. Let me just give you this table as my last slide. The first column is the impact of the intervention measured as a standard deviation of the control group. It's 0.13, 13.4, so 13.4% of the standard deviation of the control group. Now, if we take the sample in Bogota, it's an interesting sample because it covers most of the population in Bogota. 85% of the population in Bogota is representative of the bottom 85%. If in that sample we compare the child development between the top and bottom 10% in that population is 0.574. If we compare now the bottom 10% in Bogota to our control group, this is the difference is 0.093 and not significantly different from 0. So those 2 populations are comparable. Therefore, if we measure the impact as a fraction of the gap between the poor and upper middle class in Bogota is 23%. We think that this is a much more attractive measures because it's saying, okay, it's as if you take the kids from the poorest neighborhood in Bogota and you move them to the upper middle class neighborhood. That's the sort of impact that it has. And let me put my final slide on here and stop here. Thank you.
Should I jump right in, Matthew, or are we doing any Q&A?
No, I think we're going to say Q&A to the end, and we have one question coming from everybody. So why don't you go ahead? It's good to keep on questions to the Q&A.
Okay. So can everybody see my screen? I will assume you can. So thank you, Orazio. It's a very interesting presentation, and I'll be diving a little bit deeper into really Orazio's first point with a specific example around how we might think about issues of measurement, mechanisms of impacts, and how this can really help us dig deeper into understanding the effects of programs or policies.
I can't see your screen. Unless you're showing us.
You cannot see my screen?
I cannot.
Okay, let me try again. How about now?
It says you're sharing, but we just see a black screen. I wonder, are you sharing the wrong?
I see my PowerPoint. So, but let me stop again and try one more time. I'll try to just share my whole desktop. Let's see if that doesn't seem to be doing anything either, huh? Can you see my desktop now?
Just see black, unfortunately.
So I'm not sure. Maybe, Susie, do you want to share my PowerPoint given that?
I'll do my best. Hang on.
I'll try one last time. Same thing, Matthew, is it just black?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, okay, I'm not sure why that is. I see it on my screen, so hopefully Susie can share it. Okay, you can see that now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Susie. So you can go to the next slide. And you could just put everything up. So you could just click 3 times. So the one thing I wanted to kind of talk about 3 main points today. The first is about really being very clear about what our theory of change is. So actually, Orazio talked about the importance of measuring mechanisms of impacts. I think a lot of times when programs are evaluated, the time is not invested from the beginning to really think through the theory of change. What are the pathways that we think program X might ultimately affect program Y? What are all the different ways that could happen? Might it happen for some groups, but not others? And, you know, I think one point I'd like to stress is it's really important for us to do that ahead of time, right? Because that affects what we end up measuring, the type of data that we collect and how we analyze it. So first point is really about explicating a theory of change is really critical for helping us understand intended and sometimes unintended consequences of programs. The second is using, this is really right directly off to one of Orazio's points, measures that are valid, reliable, and locally relevant. So validated on the population in which we are using them. Are they really measuring the things we think they are in the populations in which we work? And then the third is when we actually do our impact evaluation to examine impacts on both those mechanisms and outcomes, that's really key. You go to the next slide. So in addition to that, you know, I'm coming from the field of developmental psychology. The example I'm going to talk about today is around early childhood education and development. And the policy context, in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals and global efforts to improve early childhood development and children's readiness for school, has really highlighted the importance of the need for assessments of early childhood development that are feasible to administer, and also conceptually and psychometrically valid on the populations in which we work.
I think you're. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Your voice is distorted. I think there's some kind of connection issue. Unless.
Let me see. Is this any better?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just speak. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Please let me know if that happens again. So the second point I was making is that the challenge in affordability and also how feasible it is to actually implement a lot of the assessments. This is true for both child development and measures of context, the home or the classroom, where it can often be a week or two of training, passing several exams, being part of an ongoing training in order to be certified to use a tool. So in many instances, particularly in low resource context, a lot of the tools we have are not feasible. They're just not affordable and not implemented. So there's really a need for increasing the types of assessments we use. We can go to the next slide. And so I want to talk today about an example. I'm sorry, you can just click 2 more times. I wouldn't have animated these otherwise. Today, this was a large-scale partnership with the Ministry of Education in Ghana, a local teacher training center, and Innovations for Poverty Action, as well as myself, Larry Aber at NYU, Jerry Bierman at Penn, to develop and test a model that would be nationally scalable to train teachers and parents with the goal of improving the quality of Ghana's national early childhood education system. So the goal was really to improve children's school readiness through changing the quality of their experiences in school. And we evaluated 2 parts of a program. The first was a teacher training and coaching program. The second was a parental awareness intervention with the goal of having early childhood as like a platform to engage parents in children's development, and also to align parents' expectations with teachers' practices around using the curriculum of the country, which was more play-based and child-centered. You can go to the next slide. And you can just click 3 times again. So we evaluated this through a randomized control trial where schools were randomized either to a control group to receive this teacher training and coaching program, or to receive the teacher training and coaching program plus this parent engagement program. So we are testing these different iterations of these programs, and you can go to the next slide. And so we really thought a lot about our theory of change. The ultimate goal was to improve children's school readiness, to improve their development through improving the quality of classrooms, but we knew that would only happen if really key changes happened between teachers and children. So you can click 1 more time. I'm sorry, 2 more times. So our key mediators here was classroom quality. What were the experiences children were having in their classrooms on a daily basis? And how did those change as a result of the program? And also teacher professional well-being, given high issues of turnover and other problems with the teaching profession. You can click 1 more time. And we evaluated, you can click 1 more time, Susie, please. Thank you. Our other theory was that parental awareness would actually enhance the impact of this teacher training program. So if it were implemented together, we'd see larger effects on both the mediators and the outcome. I'll just tell you now, that's not what we saw, and measuring those mechanisms helped us start to understand what might have gone wrong. So you can click 1 more time. And so I'm gonna focus today on really classroom quality and school readiness and how we measure those and how that helped us understand the program. You can go to the next slide, thank you. So our first question was, around the nature of the quality of classrooms and what children were experiencing and what teachers were doing. So we used a tool called the TIPS, the Teacher Instructional Practices and Processes System. This was designed for use in low and middle income countries. It's a free and open access tool developed by researchers at NYU. But we also we used cognitive interviews to adapt the tool to the Ghanaian context. So we talked with teachers and educators, we asked them about the tool, we got their input, and we actually did make some minor adaptations as a result of that. We then did, there were 19 items on the tips, and we wanted to understand if there were specific dimensions that they were measuring in this context, given that there had not been measures of early childhood educational quality before in Ghana. And so we conducted factor analyses, and we did quite a bit of work to test the predictive validity and the convergent validity. And we found 3 dimensions of quality. So if you can click 1 more time. The first was facilitating deeper learning, which was kind of instructional support, the things teachers were doing to support children instructionally. Thank you. The second was emotional support and behavior management, things that teachers were doing around, climate of the classroom, behavior management. And these are things we've seen in the literature to date on classroom quality. But the third domain that came across really strongly was the support for student expression, things that teachers were doing to really encourage students to express themselves, to develop reasoning and problem-solving skills. And this, we think, actually was one of the more transformational aspects of the classroom that was the training engendered. It was very different than the status quo of teaching. And this ends up being an important mediating factor when we try to understand treatment impacts on how teachers change their practice. So you can go to the next slide, please. The second thing I wanted to highlight was around what do we use to measure child development. So I wanted to just, if you don't know about the IDELLA, I wanted to point out this tool, which was developed over many years and by very thoughtful researchers at Save the Children to measure children's development for preschool age, 3 to 6 years old. It's a free and open access tool. Anybody can use it. You just need to register with the network. And it's developed based on many of the previous tools that you might have heard of. That have been validated, but really adapted. The goal is to make it easy to use, easy to train enumerators, and it's really drawing growing attention. And there's quite a bit of work showing that it's actually a very good tool, and I'll tell you just a little bit about that. And so you can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to highlight some analytic work that we've done with IDELLA to really try to understand, is IDELLA actually measuring the domains of development that we think it is, right? It's supposed to assess early literacy, early numeracy, social emotional skills, and motor skills. And do we actually see that there are 4 distinct areas of development that it measures? And we've done some work to show that yes, indeed it does. These are correlated with each other, but they really are measuring distinct areas. So if we are interested in early literacy, we can look specifically at impacts on that outcome with IDELLA and feel confident that we're estimating a unique developmental domain. We've also done some work across countries, 5 countries and 5 different regions, to show that we can actually, that 4 kind of factor structure holds up across different parts of the world. So there's some strong psychometric evidence that indeed IDELLA is really measuring what we think it is, and that it's actually predicting outcomes in ways we would expect. So that builds confidence in the use of the tool. You can go to the next slide. So here, what I'm going to show you now are impacts on classroom quality. So we go back to the Quality Preschool for Ghana, and I told you about those 3 factors that we looked at. We also are looking at impacts on just use of the activities from the intervention. You can just click 4 times. Let's put all the bars up, and 1 more time, please. And what you'll see here, what I want to just highlight is if you look at impacts of TT is the green, teacher training alone. The blue is that teacher training plus the parental awareness. We see fairly similar impacts in some of the domains of changes in classrooms. Both groups are using the activities from the training. Neither group is improving their instructional support. So that might point to us in the future, and when we redo the program, we might want to have more of a focus on instructional support. Both programs, we see improvements in emotional support. But here's where we started to see something went wrong with the parent awareness intervention. So if you remember, I told you that support for student expression was really the most transformational change that we were hoping teachers would make around how they engage with children. When the teacher training was implemented by itself, teachers made those changes. They did more support for student expression. When that was implemented with the parent awareness intervention, there were no changes. So the blue bar is basically not different from 0. And so we see that when parents were engaged, they seemed to push back in a way that led teachers not to make that transformational change in the classroom. So that was a sign to us that something, something went not as intended with the parent awareness group. You can go to the next slide, please. Yeah.
Can you wrap up in a couple of minutes, please?
Yeah. So you can just go to the next slide and just click 1 more time. So what we see here is with IDELLA that we have impacts on all domains when we look at child development for the teacher training. And when we look at with the parent engagement, there are counteracting impacts on academic outcomes. So we're starting to see some indications of a lack of effects on academics and on support for student expression. You can go to the next slide. And why don't you just skip ahead, I think just for the sake of time, to this one more click. So what this just, oh, sorry, go back once. This slide is just showing that we can actually break up the different components, the mechanisms, to tell us which are the ones driving change on children. You know, if we really want to focus the intervention moving forward, we see that support for student expression is one of the stronger drivers of those improvements for children, and developmentally appropriate activities, using those activities are important. So doing what's called this multiple mediation analysis, we can really start to tease apart which are those mediators, those mechanisms that are most important and impactful for children. And you can go to the last slide. Just to highlight, you know, measurement work that we did before the intervention really helped us build confidence in what we were measuring and in our impact results. Breaking our measures of classroom quality into contextually specific domains really helps us shed light on how some programs, in this case, the parental awareness, didn't operate as intended, right? It counteracted impacts. And we've done some follow-up qualitative work, which I think is also important for measurement work to help us understand more deeply what happened. But you can imagine a whole other theory of change just around those arrows, from engaging parents to what happens in the classroom. How do parents shape educational environments? Parental beliefs, social norms. So we could have a whole separate theory of change there. So just want to end with the importance of articulating those theories of change in advance, so that we can really shape the things we measure as part of our impact evaluation work moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sharon. As you're listening, everyone, please do send in questions for each specific presentation, and particularly any questions you can think of that cut across the three presentations. We'll be moving to the discussion next after Olga's presentation. Olga, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew, and good morning or good afternoon to all. Thank you to Sedale for the invitation today. I'm very glad to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Is it working? Seems so.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to do some reflections from my side, being in the public sector in Colombia, on measurement and evaluation. Some things that already both Orazio and Sharon talk about. I'm going to do a brief introduction of what I do or in the planning department, and then I'm just going to do some reflections on what to measure, how to use these existing measures, and how to construct new measures. And I do have a last slide on reflections on measurement during doing evaluations during the pandemic. So the direction of monitoring and evaluation of public policies, where I work, is part of the missionary activities of the National Planning Department. And what we do is evaluate and monitor policies, programs, and projects. And we try with that to generate quality information for decision making in the public policy cycle. As you know, evaluation is fundamental for good governance, since it can ensure the effectiveness of public sector and improve the quality, delivery, and response and efficiency of public goods and services. It also is important in that it connects policymakers and citizens, and it facilitates the process of accountability. In that scenario, what to measure in evaluations is very important, and I'm just going to reflect on some of the things that we struggle and that we see in implementing evaluations in the public sector in Colombia. So first, what to measure, and this is something that Sharon already mentioned, and I think is clear, is very important, is that we need to have a clear value change or a very specific theory of change. Policymakers should set those clear goals of the intervention for the evaluation, to have clear measures and what is expected for that intervention to change on beneficiaries. And this is something that we struggle a lot, and it's very difficult. Sometimes we arrive to evaluate a public policy, and there is no clear value change or theory of change. And it's something that we need to construct with policymakers so that we can have a more clear which is those outcomes and measures that we need to have. That is something very important. Another one is having those core metrics, using a core set of metrics to measure outcomes can help policymakers have comparison within interventions of which ones are better for childhood development, for example, or and see interventions that work in different contexts too. So that is something that I think is important also when thinking what to measure in evaluation. Also, and as Orazio was mentioning, having multiple outcomes, being aware that interventions can have different outcomes and also unintended outcomes, so that we have all the possible outcomes and measure that we need. And something that was also mentioned, which is thinking about the implementation indicators or those mediators, so that we don't have this black box of when we have the evaluation, but rather that we can explain why those effects or those outcomes that we are finding do happen or not happen. So those are some reflections on what to measure. In how to measure, this is something that we have found that is important in terms of evaluation, and it is having baseline data, but that is sometimes very difficult to accomplish in the public sector. We arrive to do an evaluation rather later on time, where we have to find out what is that theory of change and what are those outcomes that we want to measure. But if we have that possibility of starting the evaluation with the design of the evaluation, it's possible to have a baseline data that establish those measures of outcomes. Also thinking about the source of the measures, thinking about the possibility of having those measures in secondary data versus primary data. Secondary data could have a lot of limitation, but it's most cost effective. And primary data takes those times and resources. So thinking where is that measure that we are going to, what is the source of that measure is important in terms of thinking about the design of the evaluation also. Also the timing of the measure, that is something that is important. Sometimes we may do an evaluation and don't find any results, but it's maybe because we arrived too early to do that evaluation, and we need to have that in mind. Sometimes when we are in the public sector and having discussions with policymakers, they do want to evaluate quickly to have results sometimes, but those results probably take more time for them to actually see results. And also we have a variety of interventions and measures. Social interventions, there's more well-established measures that we can use and that we can replicate, but interventions on other files like democracy or governance may have more difficulty in finding what are the appropriate measures. And then there's some where self-reported behaviors you don't think are the most accurate measures you want to have, so you want to evolve to different measures. I'm going to put some examples in Colombia of how we are using existing measures. Colombia has been using a lot the multi-dimensional poverty index to measure poverty, and we have using different evaluations related to social interventions this indicator I guess the caveat of this indicator, of this measurement, is that it takes a lot of time. It's like a big survey, or it takes a lot of time to collect this type of measurement. We have also used cognitive level, for example, in the evaluation of the conditional cash transfer program, Familias en Acción in Colombia. We used the Peabody test to measure cognitive level. We have also moved to think about those measurements for mediators, like the classroom observation, and trying to measure what is happening in the class, and thinking about social capital, for example, in the evaluation of the national program of houses of justice and centers of citizen coexistence in Colombia. We use experiments to measure social capital. So we have been in different evaluations in Colombia, trying to use different measures that have been used in other countries and that have been now used in Colombia to try to have different measures of different outcomes or drivers. And reflecting on how to construct new measures, what we have seen works or could help us in terms of what we do in evaluations in the public sector. One is using qualitative information. Sometimes those outcomes that are difficult to measure, it's good to use that qualitative information, but using that qualitative information can also help you inform better to construct new measures that can be quantitative. Also, thinking about the multidisciplinary approach, learn from different disciplines to have more information about possible measures for evaluation. Also, thinking about big data or data science to explore big sets of information that can help us construct new measures for different evaluations that we are doing of different interventions, and also think about heterogeneity, considering it in results to think about new measures. Those are kind of like the reflections in terms of how to measure, how are we using those measures, and how to construct new measures. But I wanted to finish my presentation today thinking about some like pandemic, I guess, reflections on measurements. In Colombia, we just recently evaluated 2 of the social protections programs that were launched and were intended to mitigate the effects of the pandemic on the most vulnerable population. One was the value-added tax compensation programs. We did this impact evaluation with Innovations for Poverty Actions and academics from NYU and UCL. And we also conducted the evaluation of the Solidarity Income Program that was created to help those vulnerable population that were not in other programs of the government, so that they could have a transfer during the pandemic situation. It is still in place until this month, the program. And we did this evaluation in association with the Inter-American Development Bank. And when we were doing the evaluation, we needed timely and rigorous results, but we have some limitation of measurements on thinking about measurements that we wanted to include, given the theory of change that we had identified of these interventions, and is that we were conducting telephone surveys to prevent physical contact, and we have a reduced time and number of questions. So in terms of thinking about poverty or food insecurity measures that could be long to collect in a survey, we have to kind of like have a trade-off on what to measure on these impact evaluations. So it was kind of like a lesson or a reflection that we had to have on conducting these evaluations during the pandemic, and that I wanted to leave in the floor because I think we also need to think about more concrete measures for cases where we have limited time to collect data and think about using different proxies. And those were kind of my reflections from the public sector side in Colombia. And with that, I finish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olga. Bang on time and really interesting. And thank you all to all the presenters. We have some interesting questions coming in. I'm just going to kick off with a few of my own questions, but please keep the questions coming, and we'll get to those in a few minutes. I think the thing that struck me from the three presentations was the amount of agreement between the three perspectives on what's needed in the measurement field. So customized, contextually relevant measures. All three presentations talked about mechanisms and theory of change and the importance of measuring those. And looking at unintended consequences and multiple outcomes. One of the questions I wanted to kick off with was, I think that between the three presentations you've presented perhaps an ideal scenario for how measurement should be used in evaluation. From the perspective of, if you think about the incentives for researchers and those doing evaluations, it's pretty easy to, if you have a nice randomized design, measure the Baileys because it's an established instrument. Don't measure any unintended consequences. Don't assess your mechanisms. It's a pretty simple evaluation, which you may get results. So I'm interested in what you think will move the field as a whole to achieve the goals that you're looking at. I think that my experience with I've never liked using custom measures, but it's amazing how little incentive there is in the field for spending a lot of time developing separate measures. It's nice that Sharon, you talked about IDELLA, because I think that's one example of an exception where the field has come together and developed something and invested in a collaboration around a measure, but it's a relatively rare occurrence, and publication in international development is not incentivized around measurement. And there's also this question of comparability if we all develop our own measures. So I'd love to know what your thoughts are for moving the field in the direction of having more standardized, more sort of custom measures, but those that are of high quality. And I think I have a similar question about measuring mechanisms. Sharon, do you think other people will be as keen as you were to spend time developing a classroom process measure? And what are the prospects for developing standardized measures to measure mechanisms? Is it all project specific? And I guess a similar question for incentivizing measuring multiple outcomes and unintended consequences. So I'd love to know your thoughts about how to move the field in the direction that you would like. Since Olga mentioned multidisciplinary approaches, I'd also like to throw out the question of either from personal reflections, what you've learned from other disciplines, or what you see the benefits of multidisciplinary approach or collaboration across disciplines into what has sometimes been in the measurement field has been a quite siloed approach. I think I'll leave it there. Those are my questions, I think, that cut across the themes of the presentations. And maybe I can I ask Orazio to kick off with anything that you wanted to
Yes, you asked an awful lot of questions. I could talk for 2 hours about trying to answer your questions, but let me just say a couple of things. On so I'm convinced that we need to push this much more effectively than we have done so far. And when I say we, I mean the scientific community across disciplines. I'll come back to that in a second, but I think there has to be resources invested in developing measures, in guaranteeing comparability, different approaches. What Olga was saying at the end on COVID is quite important, because COVID, among the many ways that they change our lives, is made it for the need of measures that can be collected quickly, reliably, and at a distance. And it's very hard. So I think, in general, we need to push much more for that. One way from a methodological point of view that can be useful is to recognize that perfect measures do not exist. That's a phantom of our imagination. They don't exist. And so the right approach should be, okay, I get the signal about something I'm interested in, which is imprecise and affected by measurement error. And I need to, together with the theory of change that was mentioned a few times, we need to also to specify what is our model of measurement. So how do we relate the concepts that we are interested in to the measures that are available? And that's not just an academic exercise. It's a way to, it can shape the way you collect data. For instance, the way you assign interviewers. When you have measurement error and you're explicit about it, typically you want to be uncorrelated with among different between different measures and in different contexts. Well, you can engineer that by assigning interviewers in a certain way, and that's just an example. So it's useful to be explicit about the existence of measurement problems and invest resources and theoretical models to deal with that. And finally, on the interdisciplinary thing, I learned a huge amount. In the first part of my career, I was just talking to economists. Now I have interactions with developmental psychologists, child development experts, sociologists, epidemiologists, psychometricians, and I learned a huge amount. One thing that I learned, that there are lots of common themes, and there is lots of knowledge that gets lost in translation across disciplines. So I think we have a lot to gain from a better communication across disciplines.
Thank you, Sharon.
Yeah, I'll just add two things around how can we move the field forward around these issues. I think for impact evaluations, I think the push to pre-register trials is helpful because you need to pre-specify what you're going to measure, what are going to be your primary and secondary outcomes. And so in a way you have to think through, well, you don't have to, but you have a chance to think through your theory of change and what you might measure related to that. I think it would be helpful if pre-registration actually had a box, what's your theory of change? What are your mechanisms? Kind of force those that are conducting impact evaluations to really think that through ahead of time and put it down on paper or on your computer when you register so that it's also pre-specified before the evaluation is done. I think that could be a good addition. In terms of measurements, and I know IDELLA is a unique thing, but I do think there are really growing efforts to have kind of global measures that are rigorous, that have been psychometrically validated across many countries. For 0 to 3, there's the CREDI, which is a caregiver report on child development. Obviously it depends on the field you're working in, but I would say build on what's been done already. There is actually a growing base that we can be building on, all of us. So for example, the MELCO, which is an initiative by the Brookings and the World Bank led by Abby Rakes, they put forward a kind of a core set of items that they think are key for measuring classroom quality or child development. And then they have a whole other bank of items that you can also use, or you can add to their core. So that's one way of thinking, can we have kind of standardized measures? And then also, if you have the bandwidth, create some other measures or use other measures that might be directly relevant for the context in which you're working. So I would just say, as much as we can build on what's being done, I think that will help us move the field forward.
Great, thanks, Sharon. And Olga, any reflections?
Yeah, I guess I do also want to emphasize in the importance of building that value chain or the theory of change during the first phase of like thinking about an evaluation. I think that's crucial to think about those multiple outcomes or unintended outcomes or the drivers, which are crucial, as we were saying, if we are trying not to have that perfect RCT, which is just going to give us the result, the final result on the impact, but what is happening in that black box. So I think a good set of time needs to be spent in that theory of change and constructing that value chain so that we can move forward in that sense. And then definitely, as Orazio was saying, having communication with other disciplines, I think is important. It only enriches the work, and I think there's a lot to learn from these different disciplines.
Great, thank you, Olga. I'm going to pick out a few questions that I think apply to all of you, but also encourage you to look at the questions. You can actually answer them in the chat. Sharon, there's a couple for you about how you supported student expression and the multiple mediation analysis. If you can type answers to questions on the chat whilst also answering them verbally from me. So the ones I'm going to read out for now are, there's a question about what are the challenges or what approaches have you taken to measurement in humanitarian situations? There's a question from Helen Penn, which says, I was interested in Olga's comments on accountability, democracy and government. Who do researchers in this area of measurement consider they are accountable to the funders, the research community, or the government officials that you're working with? And I'm going to pick also out a question from Nancy Cartwright, which Orazio has also already addressed somewhat, but the issue of how do you identify unintended consequences, that developing a theory of change, even for the intended consequences, having a full causal model is a relatively complex endeavor. So how do you go about identifying the unintended consequences? Is there a shortcut to doing that? So do you want to feel free to just jump in and answer any question that you think it appeals to you. We can go in reverse order if you want. I'll go first.
If you want, I can jump in terms of accountability. I guess from my perspective, we are accountable to the citizens in terms of what is it that we are doing in those interventions that we are evaluating. Then definitely the information is not only going to help make better decisions, but it's going to be is helping to have that link between policymakers and citizens and being accountable for that. I don't remember the other questions, but I'm going to look at them.
That's great for now. Thanks. Sharon, any thoughts? You're on mute, Sharon. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm having technical challenges today. I was also trying to reply to Andy's comment, but I was, you know, I think the issues of mediation, which I think came up in a couple questions, and mediation analysis, you know, to do that type of analysis, you do need some quantitative data. I know somebody asked about, can you do this with a qualitative approach? But qualitative approaches are very helpful to articulating what your theory of change is, right? So talking to participants, understanding, you know, how they see things working in their context. I think that's actually very necessary work to help specify what a theory of change would be. And then adding the quantitative measures to that would be really key. Although, you know, you could do qualitative approaches to understand mechanisms, but you wouldn't be able to do that same type of multiple mediation analysis for that.
Great, thank you. And Orazio?
Yeah, I was planning to say something. You know, I replied to Nancy Cartwright question. Let me link that to what Sharon just said. First of all, I completely agree with what she says. You know, qualitative analysis is extremely useful to think about what to think about, to inform us on the development of models that we want to use to interpret reality and the like. In order to, once you get to the models, once you get to the mediation specification that you have in mind, you soon realize that the sort of measures that you need to identify those causal links are much wider than the type of stuff that that we just usually measure. Let me give you an example. This is my own research, and I don't want to publicize that too much, but you know, this is the stuff I know best. So when we did the first evaluation of this stimulation program in Colombia, we find where we don't give any resources, we just talk to the parents and interact with the child. We find that we did a randomized control trial and we got an impact of 0.2 standard deviation on the kids. Now, where did that come about? So it could be a direct impact of the program, or it could be that we changed the way parents act. Now, to distinguish that, the simple randomized control trial is not enough. What we need to do is that we can measure whether the RCT changes, the intervention changes the parental behavior, but we cannot tell them apart without some additional information, which means we need to model parental behavior. And in order to do that, you need to measure other things that drive parental behavior and don't particularly drive directly child outcomes. And so there, you know, we looked at episodes of violence that were in the past that occurred when the mothers were teenagers, and we found that that actually affects parental investment. And that allows us to disentangle the effect. And so the conclusion there that the intervention acted changing parental behavior was not the direct effect of the intervention, which brings me to the fact that, you know, the specification of models is fundamental, and it's difficult, as Nancy was suggesting, to do it ex ante sometimes. Although Sharon is right, you should think clearly about what kind of models, but it can be useful even ex post once you see the effect of the interventions. Yesterday, I listened to a presentation by Rosella Calvi from Rice. She was talking about an intervention that reduced the dowries in India. And she presented, it was not a randomized control trial, but she presented quite convincing evidence that that reduction in dowries increased domestic violence and reduced women's agency within the marriage. So talking about unintended consequences, those are dramatic ones, that are important ones. Rosella presented a beautiful model that tried to open that black box and identify the mechanisms through which, you know, the marriage markers before this could happen. And that's what the model is the essence. We need to get that to interpret the results that we get from evaluations. And in order to identify the model, we have to measure wider range of variables. Sorry to over talk.
No, not at all. Thank you. I think that we are coming up to being out of time though, so I think I'm going to wrap things up there. So thank you to our three presenters. That was really fascinating stuff, and thank you to all of you for attending and for your great questions. Please look out for a follow-up survey which will be coming about your experience of this webinar, and I'm sure several will be organizing more fascinating webinars in the near future. Okay, thank you everyone. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.